Comparison of Aristides and Cato the Elder by Plutarch. Translated by Aubrey Stewart. Now that we have related all the important events of each of these men's lives, it will be seen that the points in which they differ are very trifling when compared with those in which they agree. If, however, we are to take each of their qualities separately, as one would in comparing two speeches or two pictures, we observe that they both agree in having begun life in a humble station, and having won political distinction and power by sheer ability and force of character. It is true that Aristides rose to power at a period when Athens was poor, and when the orators and generals whom he attacked were men whose means were little superior to his own, for the men of greatest incomes at that time were assessed as having 500 bushels of wet or dry produce a year, while the next class, that of the knights, had 300, and the lowest, or those who could afford to keep a yoke of oxen, had only 200. Cato, on the other hand, came from an obscure village and a rustic mode of life, and boldly launched himself upon the turbid sea of Roman politics, although the days of Curius, Fabricius, and Attilius were long past, and Rome was not accustomed to find her magistrates and party leaders in laboring men fresh from the plough or the workshop, but in men of noble birth and great wealth, who canvassed extensively and bribed heavily, while the populace, insolent with the consciousness of power, were growing ripe for a revolt against the governing class. It was a very different thing for Aristides to have only Themistocles for an antagonist, a man of no birth or fortune, for it is said that he only possessed between 3 and 5 talents when he first embarked on politics, and for Cato to contend for the mastery with men like Scipio Africanus, Sergius Galba, and Titus Quintius Flamininus, with nothing to help him but his eloquent voice and his good cause. Furthermore, Aristides, both at Marathon and at Plataea, acted as general with 9 colleagues, while Cato was elected one of the 2 consuls, and afterwards one of the 2 censors, though there were many other candidates for both offices. Aristides never conspicuously distinguished himself, as the credit of the victory at Marathon belongs to Miltiades, and that of Salamis to Themistocles, while Herodotus tells us that Pausanias obtained the most glorious success of all at Plataea, and even the second place is disputed with Aristides by Sophanes, Ammininius, Callimachus, and Cynaegirus, all of whom won great glory in those battles. On the other hand, Cato not only, when consul, gained the greatest credit, both by his wise conduct and his personal prowess in the Spanish War, but when at Thermopylae he was acting as tribune under another person's command as consul, contributed mainly to winning the victory by his flank movement, by which he established himself in the rear of Antiochus, while that prince was intent upon the enemy in his front. This victory, which was so manifestly due to Cato, had the important result of driving the Asiatic troops out of Greece, back to their own country, and so of preparing the way for Scipio's subsequent invasion of Asia. Neither of them were ever defeated in battle, but in political matters Aristides was overcome by his rival Themistocles, who drove him into exile by ostracism, while Cato held his own against all the greatest and most influential men in Rome to the end of his life, without once being overthrown by them. He was often impeached, and always acquitted, while he frequently succeeded in his impeachments of others, using, both as a bulwark to defend himself and as a weapon to attack others, his power of speaking in public, which indeed is a quality more to be relied upon than good fortune to protect a man from suffering wrong. Antipater, in the account which he wrote of the philosopher Aristotle after his death, observes that besides this other qualities and accomplishments, this man had the power of persuasion. It is generally admitted that political virtue is the highest to which a man can aspire, and of this most think domestic virtue to be a very important part, for as a city is merely a collection of households, the public virtue of the state must be increased if it contain many well-regulated households. Lycurgus, when he banished silver and gold from Sparta, and gave his countrymen useless iron money, did not wish to discourage good household management among them, but he removed the dangerous seductions of wealth out of their reach, in order that they might all enjoy a sufficiency of what was useful and necessary. He saw, what no other legislator appears to have seen, that the real danger to a commonwealth arises from the poor and desperate rather than from the excessively rich. Now we have seen that Cato was as well able to manage his household as to govern the state, for he improved his fortune and became a teacher of household management and husbandry to others, by collecting much useful information on these matters. On the other hand, Aristides made his poverty a reproach to justice, which by his example was made to seem a ruinous virtue, which brought men to want, and was totally useless to those who practiced it. Yet the poet Hesiod, when encouraging men to act justly and manage their household affairs well, blames idleness as the origin of injustice, and the same idea is well stated in Homer's lines. Work was never my delight, nor household cares that breed up children bright, but ever I loved ships with banks of oars, and arrows keen, and weapons for wars. Where we see that the same men neglect their duties at home, and gain their living by injustice and piracy abroad. The physician tells us that oil is most useful outwardly used, and most harmful when taken inwardly. But it is not true of the just man that he is most useful to his friends, but useless to himself. It seems to me to be a blot on Aristides' fame, if it be true, that he could not even provide money for his daughter's dowry, or for his own funeral expenses. The family of Cato for 4 generations supplied Rome with praetors and consuls for his grandchildren and their children too. All rose to the highest offices in the state, while the hopeless poverty of Aristides, though he was the foremost man of his time in Greece, reduced some of his family to the disreputable profession of interpreting dreams, and forced others to live on public charity, putting it quite out of their power to emulate the glorious action of their ancestors. Some indeed may dispute this, for it is true that poverty is no disgrace in itself, but only when it is a proof of indolence, extravagance, or folly. The poverty of a laborious, upright, temperate statesman combines well with his other virtues, and shows true greatness of mind, for a man whose attention is given to little things can never succeed in doing great ones, nor can a man help others if he is in need of help himself. A statesman requires, not wealth, but contentment, in order that his attention may not be diverted from public affairs by his own cravings for useless luxuries. God alone is entirely without wants, and we approach nearest to the divine ideal when we can reduce our wants to the fewest possible. Just as a healthy man requires neither excess of clothing or of food, so a man's life and that of his family, if properly regulated, can be maintained as a trifling cost. His income, however, must exactly tally with his requirements, for we cannot call that man contented who earns much and spends little. He is a foolish man if he troubles himself to amass what he cannot enjoy, while he must be a miserable man if he is able to enjoy the use of wealth, and yet through meanness of spirit forbids himself its use. I would willingly put this question to Cato. If we ought to enjoy our wealth, why do you make a virtue of simplicity of living when you are a rich man? If, on the other hand, it is a noble thing, as no doubt it is, to eat common bread, to drink the same wine as our servants and farm laborers do, and not to want fine clothes or comfortable houses, then Aristides and Epaminondas, Manius Curius, and Gaius Fabricius were to be applauded for their neglect of the wealth, whose use they rejected. Surely it was not necessary for a man who thought turnips made a delicious meal, and who used to boil them himself while his wife baked the bread, to write so much about how to save a penny, and how a man might most quickly make a fortune. The great advantage of simplicity and contentment is, that it prevents our wishing for superfluities, or even thinking about them. Aristides, when cited as a witness during the trial of Callias, is said to have observed that those who were poor against their will ought to be ashamed of it, but that those who, like himself, were poor from their own choice, gloried in their poverty. It would be absurd to suppose that the poverty of Aristides was not voluntary when, without doing any criminal act, he might be stripping the body of one dead Persian, or by plundering one tent have made himself a rich man. But enough of this. As to their campaigns, those of Cato added but little to the already vast empire of Rome, while Aristides was present at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, the most glorious of all Grecian victories. We cannot compare Antiochus with Xerxes, nor the destruction of the walls of the Spanish cities by Cato, with the tremendous slaughter of the barbarians by the Greeks, both on sea and land. Aristides was present at every action of importance, although he gave up his share of glory and rewards, even as he did with gold and silver, to those who needed them more than himself. I cannot blame Cato for always glorifying himself and claiming the first place for himself, although he says in one of his books that it is absurd for a man either to praise or to blame himself. Still, I think that he who does not even wish for the praises of others is a more perfect character than he who is always exalting himself. An indifference to popular applause does much to soften the bitterness of political controversy, while on the other hand, a love of distinction often leads men to be ill-natured and spiteful to others, a fault which Aristides entirely avoided, and to which Cato was peculiarly liable. Aristides saved Athens by supporting the authority of Themistocles on several critical occasions, and even acting as his subordinate, while Cato by his opposition nearly ruined Scipio's famous expedition to Carthage, in which he defeated the hitherto invincible Hannibal. Nor did he cease his intrigues against Scipio until by calumnious and false accusations he drove him out of Rome, and stigmatized his brother with the disgraceful charge of embezzling the public money. Self-denial, upon which Cato has bestowed such lavish praise, was practiced in its purest and brightest form by Aristides, while Cato seems to have forfeited all claim to this virtue by his unsuitable and unseasonable second marriage. It could not be to his honor, when he was of such a great age, to marry the daughter of his own servant, a man who acted as a public clerk, and to bring her into the house to act as mother-in-law to his son, who was now himself grown up and married. Whether he acted thus from natural inclination, or to spite his son for his behavior about his mistress, the marriage and the motives which led to it are equally discreditable to him. The sarcastic explanation of it which he gave to his son is utterly untrue, for had he wished to beget other children as noble as his son, he ought to have married a well-born lady at once, and not to have been satisfied with a low intrigue until it was detected, and then to have chosen as his father-in-law the man whom he could most easily influence, rather than someone whose alliance would bring him honor and advantage.